There are inventions that light up the world, and there are those forged in shadow, built not to save lives, but to end them. In the forgotten corridors of human history, deep within dungeons, damp with blood and regret, mankind crafted devices so grotesque, so meticulously cruel, that their very existence feels like a whisper from hell itself. These were not tools of war, no. They were instruments of punishment, past the veil of mercy, into the chambers where justice dressed itself in iron spikes and fire, of pain, and once you hear it, you may never look at the word civilization the same way again. Conceived in the golden age of tyrants and philosophers, this grotesque contraption was the child of paradox. Bronze on the outside, shaped like a majestic beast, hollow within, like the conscience of its creator. It was said to be the invention of Perverse of Athens. His flesh blistering against the bronze walls as the metal heated, slowly cooking him alive in his own invention. When the smoke rose, it didn't just carry the scent of death, it carried a message. Here, we perfect suffering. A man would be stripped naked, bound between two hollowed canoes, force-fed milk and honey until his bowels betrayed him. Then, they would set him afloat on stagnant water. For days, sometimes weeks, his flesh would bubble with insects, feasting, nesting, laying eggs in his eyes and mouth. The body did not rot in silence. It gurgled, it prayed, and then it begged. A man who sought the favor of a Sicilian tyrant named Phalaris. With a twisted grin, he presented the bull as a gift, a spectacle, to render a human into a monster before death even began. Designed not just to kill, but to unmake a soul before the final breath could flee. What twisted genius builds machines that require time to kill, that feed on the screams of the living? Tonight, I will lead you down that unlit path. It was about power made visible. In a world where kings ruled by blood and priests by fire, the instruments of execution became icons of absolute dominance. This is the story of humanity's most horrifying inventions. It begins, as all dreadful things do, in silence. Not the silence of peace, but of anticipation. Of the cold breath before a scream. In the ancient world, before machines, before laws whispered of rights, there existed a darker logic. His screams will echo through the pipes, transformed into the roar of a bull. It will be art beautiful and just, delighted even. But tyrants do not like to be outdone in cruelty. So he ordered Perverse himself to be the bull's first guest. One etched into the bones of civilization itself, pain as penance, death as theater. Among the oldest devices designed not just to kill but to humiliate, to prolong, to create death slowly stood the Brazen Bull. You see, my lord, he explained, when a man is placed inside and fire lit beneath. Phalaris was intrigued, and thus the creator became the offering. They say his screams rang out like a song for the damned. The Brazen Bull was not alone. Travel east, into the Persian Empire, and you'll find the Boda device that spoke not in flame, but in wrought. But it was not just punishment. It was spectacle. Kings watched. Crowds gathered. Children stared. This was not merely death, it was a performance of divine judgment. What madness leads man to engineer such ends? The answer lies not in hatred, but in control. Torture was never just about pain. These weren't random tools. They were designed, tested, perfected, and each one told a story. A chair of spikes, not to kill instantly, but to exhaust the soul. A collar lined with iron thorns to puncture the neck at every movement. A mask shaped like a beast. This was civilization with its mask removed, revealing not progress, but primal hunger, sharpened with metal and blessed by clergy. And if you think this was the darkest we could become, no, my friend. The worst was yet to be invented. If hell had architects, they wore robes. In the echoing cathedrals of medieval Europe, where incense masked the stench of unwashed penance and stained glass bled sunlight into shadow, Another kind of design was born not of grace, but of terror sanctified. The Church, in its holy crusade to cleanse the soul, crafted tools not just to punish sin, but to purge it by fire and steel. They called it the Inquisition. Its purpose was salvation. Its method was fear. Among the Church's many instruments, few whispered of madness quite like the heretic's forca, simple tool, elegant in its cruelty. A metal rod with pointed ends strapped between the chest and the chin, or the chest and the throat. One movement, one nod, one whisper, one prayrand, the skin would tear. The voice would rupture, the soul would break. Sleep was forbidden, speech impossible. And so the heretic would sit, wide-eyed in candlelit silence, surrounded by monks who sang of mercy. Inserted into the mouth, the rectum, or the vagina. Once inside, it would open, petal by petal, tearing flesh from within. It was not meant to kill quickly. It was designed to shatter dignity, to erase the self. But mercy, here, wore a hood. For those who resisted confession, there was the pair of anguisha blossoming metal flower. What sins warranted such divine wrath? A woman who read scripture, a man who denied transubstantiation. Bishops signed documents as bodies were broken in chambers below. And all the while, the bells of the cathedral rang out like a death knell dressed in gold. A healer accused of sorcery because her hands brought comfort. Though historians debate its widespread use in our tale, it did exist an iron sarcophagus shaped like a woman, lined inside with spikes. When closed, the victim was not immediately impaled, but held tightly, cruelly, while the tips of the spikes pierced the skin, missing the heart by design. Each was met not with discussion, but with devices forged in fire and prayer. But perhaps the most haunting of all was the Iron Virgin, popularly misremembered as the Iron Maiden, bleeding, screaming, suffocating in metal. And above, carved into the lid, the serene face of a saint, unmoving. The irony was sacred. Pain, you see, was no longer barbarism. It was redemption. Monks spoke Latin as they turned the wheels. This was not the wrath of kings or conquerors. This was the cruelty of order, of bureaucracy, of ritual. A parchment signed, a man condemned, a crank turned. And just like that, another soul was saved. But something darker stirred beneath the robes and relics, because the true genius of these inventions was not in their physical form, but in the theater they created. Confessions extracted not by truth, but by terror. Bodies mutilated not in secret, but in public. And in each gasping scream, the Church heard harmony. This was not justice. This was orchestrated suffering, performed under stained glass and the weight of God. And for a time, the world watched and believed. There was a time when execution was not punishment, it was performance. Picture it. The village square choked with mud and anticipation. Children perched on barrels. Mothers clutching crucifixes. The scent of roasting chestnuts mixing with the iron tang of blood still lingering from yesterday's show. This was no accident of history. It was brought into the sun, onto the stage where peasants and princes alike could watch justice made visible. It was ritual, rehearsed, repeated. Death in the age of spectacle was no longer confined to dungeon walls. Enter the breaking wheel, also called the Catherine wheel, a giant wooden disc mounted for all to see. The condemned was tied across it, limbs splayed like a grotesque star. Then came the executioner, hammer in hand, to kill outright, but to shatter, one bone at a time. Arm, leg, rib. The victim would be suspended upside down, hung by their ankles, live, alert, inverted. Children mimicked the hangman's noose with twine and laughter. And when the sentence was read, there was silence, thick and trembling. Then a massive two-handled saw was drawn between their legs, slowly, downward. Gravity kept the brain full of blood, ensuring consciousness for as long as possible. Spine perved its way through pelvis, spine, belly, ... And still the eyes remained wide. The people were told, this is how order is kept. Again, again. Each fresh execution wasn't born purely of justice or necessity. It was born of invention. Of men who asked, how can we make the death slower, louder, more memorable? Each strike accompanied by a gasp, a cheer, a whispered prayer. Imagine, a man folded upon himself, head forced to knees, knees to chest, arms clamped tight. Steel encased him, crushing bone against bone, until blood burst from nose, ears, eyes. It was the cruel cousin to the rack, not a stretch, but a collapse. A death not of tearing, but of implosion. Sometimes the wheel would spin, displaying the broken body like a marionette of agony. They said it was to prolong the pain, but truthfully was to hold the crowd. Another marvel of malevolent invention was the saw execution, rarely spoken of now, yet burned into the chronicles of cruelty. Those who watched never forgot. But perhaps the most refined horror of them all was the scavenger's daughter, a device as poetic as it was perverse. All of this was not hidden. It was choreographed. The scaffold was erected at dawn. Trumpets called forth the town. Merchants sold meat pies beside the gallows. And then came the cry. The crowd, you see, was not just witness. It was participant. For every pike displayed with a rotting head. For every body burned at stake, ... And the people believed. What they didn't see, what no one dared to whisper, was that each new device, torture, became a craft. Execution, an art, and humanity, a canvas of ruin. Not all execution machines were forged in fire or soaked in blood. Some were crafted in silence, born in study chambers and ink-stained manuscripts, the work of philosophers who traded ethics for efficiency. Cloaking cruelty in the cold logic of justice, such was the birth of the guillotine. Unlike its barbaric predecessors, the guillotine was marketed as progress, enlightenment, a mechanical promise of equality in death. It was swift, clean, and most chillingly irrational. No more screams echoing through the square. A time when heads rolled faster than prayers could be whispered. The guillotine stood in the Place de la like a god of steel, its mouth always open. Morning to dusk, names were called. Some were criminals, some enemies of the state, others merely inconvenient. No more writhing bodies or bone-snapping spectacle, just the quiet whisper of a blade and the thud of conclusion. But within that silence was something darker still, because when death becomes efficient, it becomes repeatable. France, 1793, the Reign of Terror. Humanity refined its instruments of death with the same meticulous care once reserved for symphonies or cathedrals. Iron replaced thought, pain replaced philosophy. And in those catacombs of invention, something vital was lost. Among them, Queen Marie Antoinette. Dressed in white, stepping toward the blade, not as royalty but as reminder. Or the heretic's fork, a metal rod placed between chin and chest. Or throat and collarbone designed not to kill, but to make sleep impossible. Days passed, sanity dissolved. Among them, Maximilien Robespierre, architect of the terror, who in the end was devoured by his own invention. The machine does not discriminate, but it never forgets. And what of the iron chair? Less famous, but no less final. Constructed with hundreds of spikes, its surface burned red-hot with coals beneath. Victims were strapped in tight, skin blistering against steel, screams muffled only by the sound of their own flesh boiling. It was not built to kill quickly. It was built to prepare the soul for hell. There were also devices that disappeared into whispers, like the head crusher, which did exactly as its name foretold. And somewhere in the dark, someone took notes. Because torture, by now, was no longer improvised. It was institutionalized. From the dungeons of the Spanish Inquisition to the black books of secret police, mercy, You see, we like to believe we are better now, that such horrors belong to the past, that civilization has outgrown its shadow. But every time we turn justice into performance, every time cruelty becomes policy, every time we silence conscience for the sake of efficiency, we resurrect the same ghosts. We reset the blade. The devices may rust. The names may fade. But the design, the desire endures. So, remember this. The most terrifying invention of all was never the machine. It was the mind that built it. And perhaps still is.